Okay, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Jason Larson, and I'm the head of content here at the International Institute for Analytics, and I'm your host for today's session. And welcome to today's webinar called Building a High Data Fluency Information Ecosystem. So in case you're new to the International Institute for Analytics, or IIA, as we typically call ourselves, we are an independent, strategic, outcome-focused data and analytics advisory firm. We're practitioners working with practitioners. Analytics is all we do, and we do it with a relentless focus on measurable impact. We believe that people drive change, not data, and we pride ourselves on high-touch client interactions to provide customized solutions to achieve your critical priorities. Visit our homepage for more information about who we are and how we support data and analytics organizations and enterprises in making the difficult and necessary transition to advanced analytics and AI. All right, so before we dive into the presentation, let's go over a few housekeeping items. First, we're excited to announce our next webinar on May 20th, with Mark Demarest, an IIA expert and principal at Numinal. Mark will discuss the federated analytics operating model and optimal ways to organize analytics. In IIA's point of view, one of the more common reasons why large-scale analytics programs fail to deliver significant and sustainable business value is deficiencies in the ways analytics is organized to serve demand-side constituents and information consumers. Mark will discuss why centralized and distributed analytics operating models often fail to scale, the core design principles behind the federated analytics operating model, and a starting blueprint for transitioning to or resetting federated analytics operating models. Follow the link in chat for more details and register today. We look forward to seeing you there. For today's session, we encourage you to submit questions or comments via the chat window, and we'll make sure to save time at the end of the session to address as many questions as possible. You know, the dialogue and questions that we generate is really the part we're most excited about, so don't be shy. Converse as a group in the comments, share resources, send us your questions. It very much elevates these virtual sessions. A recorded version of this webinar will be available and emailed out after the presentation. All right, so without further ado, we are delighted to welcome Ryan Sousa as our featured speaker today. Ryan is an IIA expert and former CDAO at Seattle Children's Hospital, among other health systems. I'll let Ryan add a bit of color to his background, but I would be remiss if I didn't thank him for the practical guidance that he's given to our clients over the years on a range of challenges that DNA leaders face across industries and the many ways in which he's contributed to IIA's resources for the community. Namely, Ryan raised his hand to start a blog series on data innovation in healthcare. His next article on the data community will be published tomorrow, so keep your eyes peeled for the new piece in our newsletter and social. And this article brings us up to, I think, 19 pieces in the series. And these are not puff pieces. I mean, this is really good storytelling, detailed frameworks, and actionable advice across the series. While the primary audience is DNA leaders in healthcare, so healthcare folks in the call, carve some time to read the series. There's something for everyone who is at a large legacy enterprise striving to mature their analytics. If you're joining us today, we're assuming you're on a data strategy and execution journey. To help you in your efforts, we created a new comprehensive executive guide detailing IIA's 10-step data strategy framework with tools and templates to put it into action. A strategy that serves demand-side constituents, your analysts, data scientists, and business decision makers. Those on the call today get first dibs at downloading the guide. Follow the link in chat for the download, and we hope you find it useful. And data fluency is really the bridge between the data strategy framework and making it real as an enterprise-wide ecosystem, which is a key thread in our data strategy resource hub, which I think is the perfect segue to turn it over to Ryan and help us define what data fluency is, why it matters, and explore the building blocks and the ecosystem in action. So Ryan, I'll let you take it from here, my friend.
Thanks, Jason, for the introduction and kind words. Really appreciate it. So let me pull this up. Is that showing okay?
Yep, coming through good.
Right, great. So I'll give you a little bit of my background just to give you some context for what I'm talking about and maybe how I think about things, a little bit here. As Jason, mentioned, I got into healthcare about 10 years ago, and the series is really about taking a lot of my experience in other industries, whether it be retail like Amazon or Starbucks, as well as travel organizations like Expedia, communication, automotive, and really how do we adapt a lot of what we've learned in these other industries that are a little bit further ahead, and then apply those into healthcare. And so hopefully today's discussion really kind of covers the breadth of that in a way that's useful, for you. But I also, have my own company where we help basically do what Jason just described, which is helping organizations move from data strategy to, data execution. And also to sort of advance things, in addition to IIA, I chair a Healthcare Data and Analytics Association, which is heavily focused on, if you can think of IIA, but just really heavily focused on the healthcare space. And I've also I'm advisor for Adaptex, which is a startup that we spun out of Seattle Children's when I was there. But just a little bit of more, you can kind of see the breadth of things, but we've kind of covered this. This should be enough context to kind of give you an idea of where I'm coming from as we talk through these things. And this is what we're going to talk about today, right? We're going to explore how data fluency is essential to unlocking really your full value of your information ecosystem wherever you are, and strategies to really help deepen that, which I think is an important part of the discussion. And really trying to do it in a way that appeals to a broad audience. So regardless of your industry, whether you're a senior level person, somebody who's a frontline leader, or an individual contributor, hopefully as we go through this today, you'll find something of value to you to help take it to the next level within your organization. So we'll talk about, what is, data fluency, and, why does it matter, right? So presumably you're curious. That's why you're here today. We'll talk about the 4 building blocks of a high data fluent ecosystem. How do you move from awareness to mastery? And I have some examples that we'll walk through as part of that. We'll talk about strategies for accelerating your journey, and then just some closing thoughts and open it up for Q&A. This is, I'll start it off with a little bit fun, as we kind of get into this. And so here's an example of something that is not data fluency. And I'm sure, this really struck home. I've been in places early on in my career where, it became sort of an intellectual exercise, right? And I remember when data modeling was the big thing back in the late 80s and early 90s, and doing third normal form and fourth normal form, and then we're getting to fifth normal form, and on and on and on. And then we kind of lost track with why we do all this in the first place, right? Which is to create business value. And this is when I see something like this, it always reminds me, this is where we've gotten off track, right? It's become an intellectual kind of exercise, and not something focused on business value. So data fluency, like one of the examples that I always fall back on that early on sort of had this aha moment to me was working at Amazon. And this was, 98, 99 to, early days. We had just moved out of the 5-story building downtown, Seattle, and things were starting to take off, but it was still a world where there's a lot we didn't know, right? Like we didn't know if .com was going to be a thing. Was the internet really going to play out? Are people going to buy online? There were still a lot of debates around whether people were going to use their credit cards online, right? It seems kind of silly in hindsight. But one of the big things, though, is how do you build a website, right, in order to support this new need, this new consumer? How do you get people out there? How do you optimize it? And so as part of one of my first efforts, there, I took on built out a team focused on A/B testing, right? And so the idea was, people come to the website rather than just willy-nilly making changes and see what happens and debate it all over the place, which is kind of was going on at the time. Let's get out there and let's create this way to have multiple versions of a web page, and in a very quantified way, start to understand which is performing better depending on what it is you were going to do. And it was kind of evolutionary. Like Amazon, one of the things that if you were in it, you probably remember, point of sale data was really what state of the art was. That's the data that we had. With e-commerce, we all of a sudden knew everything. We knew a door you walked through, we knew what aisles you walked down, what you put on the shelf, you took off the shelf, blah, 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 right? Like the entire consumer experience was digitized. And that's super relevant because like in the world that we're in today, we see that happening again across many, organizations. And that as much as AI is really driving a lot of the disruption that we're seeing. But in that environment, it was really simple. We had weblog data. We started to understand the website. Then we started to build a framework so that everybody could jump out there and do their own tests. And all I remember was just everybody debating, right, at the end of the test, whether or not it was the test won or not. And the conversation was really about, well, is that the right definition for conversion? Is that the right definition for this? Is that the right definition for that? So instead of like arguing about what is the best experience for the consumer, it became more an anecdotal argument. And so then we decided kind of to move to the next stage, right? We had some awareness of the importance of data, but we hadn't really started to become savvy, right, with that data. So the next step was standard metrics. And you would think, great, we got the standard metrics, we're in good shape. No, it just meant that people got like better at arguing. So we would go out there and do a test. Someone would say the goal was to increase number of orders. We didn't increase number of orders, but then they would come back and say, well, but that's short term. Long term, it's going to help us, right? We can't really measure long term. So again, we still got into this sort of exercise of arguing about what we did. We've moved along this kind of the path of maturity, but we were still not, our literacy wasn't there, right? When you take a look at it. The next stage was really to start to say, okay, great. Then before we actually do the test, tell us what you're trying to achieve. What's your hypothesis? How are you going to measure the outcome? And then, boom, all right, do your test and then show whether or not you achieve that outcome. And if you did, we move forward with the new treatment on the website. And if we don't, basically, that treatment isn't going to happen. And that was kind of the step that really pushed us to the next level. And so you can kind of imagine at that point, there were no politics in the discussion around what change was going to go in or not. Matter of fact, early on at that point, really, if there was any politics, is which things should be A/B tested. So then we scaled the environment so that everything on the website that got placed was tested before it was placed. And so we had this very tight process now for how we measured success before the change was made. And we became a much stronger, higher data fluent organization, achieving mastery, at least in that level within Amazon. And then over time, they continued to sort of that played out across the work we did at supply chain. It played out on the work that we did within customer service and so forth. That would be kind of an example of a high data fluency type of environment. And so let's take a look at why all of this matters. So you're probably experiencing, it's hard to imagine an industry that's out there right now that isn't being disrupted in some way. Like what used to be business as usual is no longer the norm. And so there's a lot of forces for change driving that. Clearly, global uncertainty, which has been building up, but recently has just really taken off, creates a lot of that consumer expectations, revenue opportunity. You've got competitive pressures. We're raising the bar around data ethics and privacy, thankfully, regulatory changes, emerging technology. These are probably all things that are really kind of creating the opportunity to drive change. And then, of course, you've got forces against it, which is, you've got cost reduction pressures in this environment. So how do you invest and cut cost, organization culture, operating practices? And so there's a lot of things going on. So how do you navigate that? Well, one of the things that's going on, and we talked about this briefly earlier, was this whole idea of AI is a big part of this, but a bigger part of this, I think, is that the consumer experience is being digitized, almost every aspect of it, which means, like, for example, if you're in healthcare, instead of having the pulse, for the patient every 30 minutes, you have every aspect of their biometrics streamed off the bedside 24/7. You are capturing more data in a day than you used to capture in an entire year. But now that data can be used to do things like detect sepsis in the ED. And so all of a sudden, if you can start to use that data, leveraging analytics and AI, you can start to really transform how you operate, step changes within your organization, create a better consumer experience. And data fluency in this environment is really the accelerant. How well you can do that. You got the data, you got the analytics and AI, but how well do you bring those things together really ties back to your data fluency. And there's a couple of great books out there that talk to this. One is Competing in the Age of AI, which kind of covers a lot of what was happening during the dot-com period and how that transformed kind of the industry using AI. Fail Fast, Learn Faster covers it also for a lot more of the traditional industries, but great books that kind of help describe what's going on that you might be able to leverage. And I'll be kind of dropping some books in here along the way just to give you a little something to read offline. So I do think a lot of this comes back to, we talk a lot about like this virtuous learning cycle, right? Where we have a hypothesis, we want to go ahead and act on that. We want to evaluate it on the other end. And then we just kind of keep going in circles, right? Because each time we pass through this, we learn more about our organization and how we want to operate to become more effective. And the landscape changes as well, right? And so as the landscape changes, we also want to use this as an opportunity to understand how those changes affect how we operate today, where the opportunities are being created in this new landscape, and then being able to adapt and capitalize on those opportunities. And that's what organizations who are highly data fluent are very good at doing. And as you know, though, probably with a lot of places, we form sometimes pretty well. We decide, sometimes we struggle with that. Eventually, when we act, we don't evaluate on the other end. And it really is about getting good at all of these things. And this is where data fluency comes in, right? It's the ability to use the language of data to swiftly exchange and explore ideas, take actions, access results. And then the idea would be, as you're doing this, getting better, ever reducing the time from the idea that you had to the action and to evaluation of that action. And getting to a place like we were at Amazon with the website changes, evaluating everything before we decide what we're going to do, and really doing it in a way that is quantitative, not qualitative. And the reason that this is such a focus is kind of tying back to that example of what's not data fluency is this idea of value creation, right? So for me, like the last 35 plus years, it's been about how do we use data to create value within the organization? And I'm sure a lot of you, if not all of you on this, are of the same kind of opinion. And really, how well you do this translates to business value. And I just came up with this really simple picture of an environment where it's kind of low data fluency, right? And I think it's helpful to look at it this way for a number of reasons. One, you can kind of see the value. It varies quite a bit. And it takes a little while to actually get through the virtuous learning cycle. And this is probably stating a best case scenario, right? In a low data fluency environment. Sometimes these circles, the value is going to be a lot smaller. And in some cases, we didn't do the evaluation part, right? And so we might have moved forward with a decision, even though anecdotally we were able to convince ourselves it was the right thing to do. But quantitatively, maybe it wasn't, but we just don't know. But we celebrate success, right? Also, velocity is slow. And it's really hard to adapt in this environment because you're sort of committed to this idea of let's focus on a few big things, right? Now, if you look at organizations that are highly data fluent, it looks a lot more like this, right? Because of automation, because how they work together as a community, because they have high quality data and a single source of truth, because they're highly data literate, they can actually iterate through these cycles very quickly. So they tend to do a better job picking things, to focus on. They're always measuring success, but they're able to do that, whether it is or not, because it's highly automated, right? There's standard tools, there's standard dashboards, there's self-service analytics, and you're also engaging the entire organization in the process of innovating with data. So it's no longer centralized or sort of in pockets of parts of the organization that are fortunate to have the ability to do this, but now you really democratize not just access to data, but the ability to analyze and use that in ways that create value for the organization. So this is why data fluency is so important. You can imagine in this same time period, the number of additional changes that you're making during this time. We applied something similar to this, for quality improvement at Seattle Children's, and we were finding that we were learning more and acting more and creating more value for our patients in a month or two once we had an environment like this set up than we were doing in an entire year. And certainly, websites like the one that you use today at Amazon wouldn't have been possible without being able to do something like this. And so as you get to this becomes a differentiator, right? Not only to being competitive, but also being able to adapt to the landscape. All right, great. So let's jump in and let's talk about some of the building blocks of a high fluency ecosystem. And it really is very simple, right? So if you're trying to form, act, and evaluate, you know what? You've got to really do well across really all four of these areas, right? As you've got to have really strong data consumers out there who are very literate. You have producers that can partner really well and understand the business and the data that supports the business. A data platform that's highly automated and provides a lot of self-service. And at the end, the force multiplier is how those all come together as a community. So let's dive into each of those areas a little bit and talk about what goes on there. So as you would expect with the data consumers, they are the people that are out there looking for the opportunities to leverage data to improve workflow. So if you're in healthcare, you're trying to streamline patient flow. If you're in retail, you're trying to optimize your supply chain. These are the people that are out there who are knowledgeable about the business and how to be able to leverage data to improve processes within the business. And they're not just looking at how do we help people become more effective to support the processes, right? They're also looking for ways to actually automate what those people do. So, Amazon example for recommendations, that used to be done by people. In time, they leveraged algorithms to create the recommendation. Not only was it more cost effective because there were no people in the loop and it was very adaptable, it also actually created a unique store experience for every consumer. And so you kind of get that dual effect if you've got data consumers that are highly literate, looking at not just how to leverage data to help make people more effective, but also how do we optimize process and then move people to more higher value areas. And so, and if you're doing it right, you've got everyone involved across the organization. They champion data fluency, and sometimes, like the consumer of what goes on here isn't people. Sometimes the consumer that goes on here is other applications. Sometimes the data consumer is also the data producer, and they leverage self-service tools to help themselves. And that becomes a really powerful multiplying effect. Producers partner very closely with data consumers, as you might expect. They're the data analysts, data engineers, the data architects, all the people that help support ad hoc requests. They're the people that help build data products to support self-service within the organization. And they're also champions as well, but they partner very closely with the data consumers. And when things are working well, are actually embedded into the business that they support. And then, of course, your data platform is probably the easiest thing for a lot of us to understand. It's the tools and technologies and frameworks and standards. If it's working well, it's highly automated. It doesn't require a lot of people to operate it. And it really empowers data consumers to help themselves within the environment. And over time, what happens is your software engineers automate what data engineers automate what data analysts did, and then, on and on it goes, right? Where you've got, consumers taking on more and more of the capability that they used to have to wait on other people for. But at the end, like I said, the force multiplier is you can have these working in pockets within the organization, but really until people start to collaborate across those different parts of the organization and everyone is involved, you really haven't achieved the multiplying effect of data fluency. And so, you're kind of blocked, right? You're kind of halfway to mastery, but really it's about bringing that community together. And it's something that doesn't just happen later. It's something that should be happening along the way, little by little, as you kind of move through it. And we'll talk about some strategies that you can use to do that. And then data fluency evolves, like I said, together. And so you can kind of, as you think about, the kind of the four stages, your data aware, your data proficient, your data savvy, data mastery. So if you were to break it up that way, you're kind of doing a little bit of everything. As time goes on, the focus becomes more heavily, capabilities, data consumers, data producers, and how do they work things. And then community and data platform really continue to evolve together kind of behind the scenes to really strengthen the capabilities of data consumers and data producers. And I always think of like data aware as, it's like you have access to data. It's about intuition. Then you start to get good at telling stories with data, right? That would be more, proficient. And then you start to get good at, integrating, that data, those capabilities into the workflow, because that's always a big challenge. And you don't really get value until you do that. And then ultimately you're trying to get into like intelligent automation, right? Where you've taken people out of the loop for certain functions and you have, bots that are out there, doing a lot of this work for you. This has been going on for a long time. I know we talk a lot about it today in the context of some of the newer types of AI. But if you look at leading organizations that are out there, and especially a lot of the online organizations with all that data, they've done a ton to really automate their business leveraging algorithms. And so now it's like, how do we take those to organizations that are more traditional, haven't done that, and do it there as well? And fortunately, some of the new LLM type of technology just makes it much easier to do because you're not only democratizing access to data, but also the AI that leverages that data. But you can kind of see how the community kind of changes as well, right? No community at the beginning starts to form, it expands, and then you kind of got unification, right, as you get into mastery. And as you move up the chain, you see greater business value. And as I said, it's not linear, right? You start to see, a factor change, right? As you start to see the community come together. And it ties kind of nicely, to IIA's Delta Plus stages. So I thought I'd put those in there as well for reference. All right, so let's move from awareness to mastery, right? And let's look at the ecosystem in action. And what I've done is drawn on some of my experiences in other organizations over the years. And I thought I would just share those with you, and hopefully some of this will be familiar. So let's talk a little bit about like how does a community operate? So this is an example of kind of a community that's in the kind of the phase of like data aware. And you can kind of see they're not working as a community for sure. There's separation between the data platform and the producers and consumers. Probably the nature around how a lot of that work gets done is very transactional through ticketing systems. You have data analysts embedded all over the place. Sometimes we'll call that shadow IT functions. And they're out there kind of, reinventing the wheel. And so this is, a healthcare, example, right? And very common in a lot of healthcare systems. And frankly, when I came into Expedia, it looked a lot like this as well, except instead of different departments within a healthcare system, it was different brands, hotels.com, Expedia, Hotwire, and so forth. And they were getting value in their pockets, but the reality is you're arguing a lot about what is length of stay mean? What's the right definition for length of stay? Or clinical visits. What's the right definition for clinical visits? And so the conversation isn't about what's going on in our business and how do we improve it and how do we create a better patient experience. It's more about arguing about the data. And then there's also the kind of the situation where some people have the capability, some people don't have the capability, and everybody's unhappy with the quality of data. And nobody thinks IT's super effective, and that's part of the reason why they've built out these different functions within the business. And so this is a how some, and I would even say this is probably not really a community, right, at this point. It's just a group of people doing the best they can to create value. And frankly, this is the starting point, for a lot of organizations. And I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's actually quite common. And then, when you look at data mastery, would be Seattle Children's as an example, right? Where there are no embedded, resources anymore doing analytics, right? They're all working as a community. And so to the extent that they are embedded, they're embedded as, part of the business, working together across the different parts of the business. There's people are, and so they're working as a community. There's a single trusted source of truth. Dashboards and reports are deeply integrated. And so if you go out there and look, there aren't a lot of reports that are sitting out there dormant. And if they are, they won't be there very long. Self-service analytics is all over the place. So physicians who want to do quality improvement and have an idea for doing that, they don't have to get a data analyst or a data scientist or a data engineer. They can just try the protocol change, see what the results were, and kind of iterate on it themselves without actually having to get in a queue or wait on somebody to do some analysis for them. And so they're leveraging these self-service tools. And a good example of that was a number of years ago, they applied kind of A/B testing to quality improvement. And a physician came across a paper and saw that, there was an approach for managing pain that didn't involve using opioids. And they were able to do the analysis to kind of see before and after, pain score, nausea score, if they were to use the non-opioid, treatment, what was the change? And they found that it was as effective as opioids. And opioids is a high risk proposition, right? 2 out of every 20 kids who get opioids, right, when they go in for surgical, are likely to gain long-term dependence on it. And so this was something a physician was able to do themselves, really transform outpatient surgery within that organization, and has continued on to be used by all the physicians within that organization. So you can imagine with that example how powerful that is in terms of creating higher quality care at lower cost within the organization. Analytics focus, we're moving to more predictive. It's not about how busy were we today or yesterday. It's how busy we're going to be in the next 12 hours. And that's transformative. And automation is king, right, in this environment. So like we look at how work gets done. So kind of like if you look at that first picture, it looks a little bit like this. It's very transactional, right? So you've got an idea, you go into a request queue. Maybe if you're lucky, you get a data analyst, goes into a request queue because they need data from the data warehouse. Data engineer works on it, passes it back to the analyst. They combine it with some other data. And then eventually you'll get, probably something in Outlook, either a PowerPoint or Excel. Maybe if you're lucky, it'll be Power BI or something along those lines. So very slow kind of, difficult process. And then they may have forgot what the question was by the time they got the answer to it. So really, data mastery looks a lot like this, where there's no barriers between these different groups anymore. They've been organized into, these agile teams, and they align these teams and are embedded in, strategic areas of strategic and operational priority for the organization. The other thing that goes on, they do the ad hoc like the other example, but one of the big changes is they start finding opportunities to create data products to promote self-service. So that in the future, some of these regular ad hocs that come in can actually be done by the data consumers. Now, this not only helps people that are making these ad hoc requests, it also opens the door for participation in analytics across a much broader organization. And so this becomes, very powerful. And then thinking about how data is consumed, right? Data aware versus data mastery. So this is an example of a big coffee company where, at the end of the day, when you looked at it, leaders within the organization, could be store managers, for example, we're spending a lot of time just bringing data together, maybe as much as 40 to 50 minutes a day in the back room, instead of spending time with their patrons and with their employees. The other issue that you run into in this environment too is the quality isn't, terribly good across this environment. So it takes a lot of time to kind of pull things together. And the question is when you're doing that, looking at how this sort of expands across the organization, what's the likelihood that everybody has the same definition for thing like, visits or, revenue per store or year over year revenue growth? At a high level, maybe, but really when you start looking at it and you start to compare it across the organization, it's not going to match up. And so it's really inefficient, very expensive. And at the end of the day, we're probably making bad decisions, right? Having analytics isn't helping. It might actually be hurting. So this is something that Starbucks did. They basically created a dashboard used across the 1,800 retail locations. It allowed the store managers to understand the health of the business in 1 to 3 minutes, basically a glance, clear calls to action, and then detail to take action. So now all of a sudden they're not spending almost no time in the back room anymore. They're spending all their time on the floor. And one of the things and they're aligned with their leadership. So they're divisional leaders, they're vice presidents within the organization up to the CEO. The other thing that became really powerful is not only did we streamline and unify decision making, in the process we embedded best practices for being a store manager in these dashboards. And so you started to institutionalize that as part of an effort. And then, of course, in this world, we had, people providing ad hoc support for things that people couldn't do within their dashboards, looking for opportunities to refine it. And also objects are shared across this environment. So like Seattle Children's did something very similar. And so census, which is really critical for everybody, existed almost on every dashboard. And if it ever changed the definition, we change it in one place and it would change everywhere. And so it's also really effective in terms of reducing your cost for ongoing maintenance. And so this is an example of what data mastery looks like. All right. So let's talk about some of the strategies then for helping us get there. And so those are real life examples. Those are things that I've lived through over the years as a leader for data and analytics in those organizations. And what I want to talk about are some of the things that I've found useful as we start that journey, regardless of where they are. Most of the time, when the journey starts, most of the time the experience for me has been data aware. Maybe a little bit beyond that, but really that's kind of their starting point. And so we're always moving towards data mastery. And so here are some of the things that I found are very useful as we start in on that kind of that journey. The one thing that I always like to do and is I love spending time talking to people the first 30 days because usually a lot of the best ideas of what we need to do to build data mastery are out there. And people have a lot of great ideas on what we need to do to get there, and they just don't know how to get started. And so it's great just to sort of listen to all the ideas and start to collect those. And as you do, start to form a really bold and inclusive vision. And you can't be too bold. If people aren't telling you it's not possible here, then you're probably not bold enough, right? Usually the measurement for me is I've got, a third of the folks that are super excited and are all about this, maybe some sitting on the fence, and then a group of people that are like, yeah, this will never happen here. That's usually kind of how it starts. It breaks up into those three groups. And so I focus heavily on the core folks because they're going to help execute on this bold vision. And then what will happen is the people on the fence will come along. And then eventually, hopefully, the people that are noisy will come on board on their own, or they really aren't as relevant, right, at that point. So yeah, include as many people as you can here, figure out where they are, got to meet people where they are, and then build that bold vision. And so, if you want a book on being bold, there's actually a book called Bold. So there you go, something that you can use. And then the next thing for me is, like I said, 30 days listen, 30 days plan, 90 days, let's start to execute. And really, capturing all of what I learn around, where we are, where we want to go, how we want to get there, all gets put into this action plan. And so, and it's not like your typical strategy document. Yeah, there's business context in there. There's the charter for the community that we're going to build together. There's the operating model for how we're going to get work done. There's the plan for the next 6 to 12 months. But it's really time boxed, right? You got to be, doing something, within 90 days. Otherwise, people lose interest. And so the idea is to plan just enough to get started, get moving on it, and it's a living document, right? Every 6 to 12 months, go back and revisit it, make some refinements. Usually about 2 years into it, it's pretty stable, and you can start to plan 12 months out if your industry is not changing too much. And so to me, this becomes such an important part of that journey. But again, the idea is to plan just enough, to get started and then just evolve it over time. If you do this right, usually I find you get good traction in 12 months, regardless of the size of the organization. And really 18 to 24 months, you start to see acceleration in the movement towards data mastery. Oh, and of course, there's books out there that can give you some nuggets on things in terms of how to frame something like this. The other thing you've got to do is break down silos. This is a big thing for a lot of organizations. You've got some centralized, you've got some decentralized, maybe some things that are sort of in between. Ultimately, you're trying to move towards small teams aligned to strategic and operational priorities embedded in the business they support. If you still go to the office, it's great if they can just sit with those business partners that they're working with. And then, of course, they should be collaborating as a community as well, building out a common data platform. And so the more and more you can move towards that little by little over time really helps to get you where you need to go. But you gotta step away and break down these silos. And usually you'll know if you've got silos if everything that needs to get done goes through a ticketing system. And then, and it just doesn't work for the analytics because it's such an iterative process of prototyping, trying something, give it to the user, they look at it and say, that's not, now that you've given me this isn't quite what I need to do what it is we're doing. And so the idea is to really start to build that really close, tight-knit collaboration where they're no longer viewed as customers within the organization, but they're viewed as partners. And you're no longer viewed as a supplier, right? You're viewed as a partner, and you're working together to support, your consumers and your customers. And so a new way of operating and thinking I find can be really helpful. This is very traditional, where you have, in healthcare, these different areas that people end up focusing on. They might have been lucky and they convert an operational role to hire a data analyst. And so they're kind of off doing their own thing, which is kind of a high risky proposition. They're making requests to get a data analyst to do the work that they need to do. There's a committee that prioritizes those. There's a lot of times another committee that prioritizes data engineers that are needed to support the data analysts. And eventually, the work gets done, but as you can kind of see, it's very centralized, very transactional, and not very dynamic. So if your business is changing, it's going to be really hard to adapt this picture. Where a lot of organizations are moving, especially ones that are, if you look at are high in mastery, at some level, they're becoming more federated. I'm excited to hear, the next webinar. Know Mark Demarest from many, many years ago, back in the 90s, where he was the only person saying, oh, we've got data warehouse and data marts. Maybe it's not either or. Maybe they should be coming together. And I still have that paper that he wrote back then, kind of covering that. So it'll be, I'm sure, a great talk, as he goes through this. Nobody knows it, better than he does. But the more you can move here, and maybe, you can't get here day one, but the goal is to always look for opportunities. Because like to get here, there's automation that's needed. There's organizational maturity that needs to happen. You might have to centralize your data engineers initially before you can actually move them into distributed teams. It requires frameworks and tools. But the ultimate destination is really something like this, right? As you're working towards it. And as you get here, it really opens up who can participate. It opens up self-service. It promotes a lot more automation, leveraging algorithms within your organization. And so it's very lean and also very adaptable. And also a new way of thinking, right? So how you get there really is, and part of the reason you do it is you're really trying to establish shared ownership and accountability. So when you start looking at something that you're building, right, you share that ownership with your business partner. Their job at the end of the day is really to help guide how things get, what gets done, and they help to guide adoption and leverage so that we're getting value, and also to be able to demonstrate the return on investment. And then if you're a technology leader, your job is to figure out the how part of it, right? In that partnership. And a lot of times with these teams, if you can do something more like a Scrum approach, where you replace your Scrum master with a dev owner, and you have a product owner, they work together, right? One representing the business on what gets done, one representing the technology and how it gets done. And that's how you build towards delivering value quickly and effectively, at the same time also building a common data platform across the organization. And so that first bullet, I think, is really important. I think also turning the pyramid upside down a little bit and promoting decision making where the work is done, moving towards an intrinsic approach. If you're using mandates to get things done, that's a great example of extrinsic. I don't ever use mandates ever. I find they don't work very well. And for me as a leader, I kind of see them as a cheat. I figure if I have to mandate, it means something's not worth doing, or I'm not doing a very good job explaining why it is worth doing. And I find that to be a more healthy way, to do that. And so in these operating models and these modern kind of approaches, the people on these teams are no longer going to their executive sponsors for approval, right? They're going to the executive sponsors to let them know what they're doing. The job of the executive sponsors all of a sudden is no longer about direction, right? The executive sponsors are more there to provide context to promote good decision making where the work is done. But integrating business, clinical, and technology is really powerful. Allowing team members to get really deep and a part of the business, both in terms of the data that's needed to support it and how to use that data to drive value. And so that becomes really important. And over time, you may have people that are interested in moving around to different parts of the organization. Very common for data engineers and data analysts who have been in one place for a while, are experts at it, and now they want to kind of grow their careers. Again, focus on strategic operational priorities, engaging senior leadership at the appropriate level. So committees tend to not show up in environments like this, and advocating for autonomy and agency as much as possible. And there's always constraints depending on your organization, but you always should be looking at, if you're going to can't be done here, the first question would be, well, first go to what would have to happen for it to be done here? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Some great books, though, around intrinsic motivation and the power of it by Daniel Pink, and how it's applied in a nuclear submarine, which is they can do it there. I'm sure we can do it in just about any industry. And then this is really important. Demonstrating value iteratively and often. So can't say enough about this. Really get into more of a do and adapt versus plan and implement approach to doing things. We talked about promoting ownership. Be okay with people willing to fail, right? So I've always kind of, like in healthcare, I always encourage the team to try things, right? In the early days when I come in, people are always asking of approval. Eventually, every time they ask for something, they say, "What do you think we should do?" And they will tell me, and then I'll say, "Go do it." And sometimes they fail, sometimes they succeed. The only requirement I have when I talk to them is just don't create legal liability, financial risk, or put kids in harm's way, right? Or patients in harm's way. Other than that, try things. If they don't work, learn from it. And it's really powerful because that learning experience that they get when things don't work really is a game changer as you grow your maturity as an organization. And of course, there's books for that. We talked about the community as the force multiplier at the end of the day, having that shared brand that brings everybody together. When people start thinking, like they're not trying to break down, like for example, enterprise analytics is really kind of a common brand to give analytics in healthcare. Um, Sometimes you may come up with your own brand, but the important thing is whatever that brand is, it can't belong to any part of the organization. Because a lot of times the people that are doing the analytics aren't all reporting to the same person. And I've yet to come into an organization, um, like my last job, like Expedia, it was all over the different brands that were out there. I had to figure out how to get all those folks working as a community to be effective. and to be highly data fluent. Uh, Seattle Children's was the same way, people embedded all over the place. So the journey had to start with a way of how do we come together under one brand, and that was a way to kind of make it all happen without doing big reorgs. If you can do them and you can get everybody reported in one place and it works, good for you. But I find that doesn't happen very often, and sometimes it's not beneficial. Like when you're starting to roll this out, one of the ways you can effectively manage change, like change management is always a big thing, but it becomes less of a big thing if the people that you focus on are willing participants. And so my goal is we're building the community, focusing first on willing participants in areas that we can create value, show that the operating model works. Usually others see that and they want to be part of it. And then as time goes on, the community sort of builds out until everybody probably will end up reporting to the same person potentially at the end of the day, but it's a byproduct of the process. It's not required to build that data community. So this is really important, really powerful. If you've got somebody with great marketing skills, I mean, this is what marketing does. And it really ties back to Sapiens. And one of the things they think that we have that allowed us to organize effectively and survive when other human species didn't. So we could organize around ideas, right? Whereas Homo erectus or Neanderthals couldn't do that. And so maybe they could organize 100 people at a time. Well, if you can organize people around an idea, you can organize thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people. And so leverage that capability to build your community. And then don't let the mindset get in the way. I think this happens. It's amazing. This was something that came out of a 1955 paper of the 50 reasons why we cannot change. And they're so relevant, right? I lost track. I've yet to come into a place to promote something and not have heard this. And usually if I don't hear this, I usually think I'm not shooting high enough or people aren't being honest. But if people are being honest and we're shooting high enough, you're going to hear these things for sure, which, to me is almost validation. And then I think there has to be a conversation that starts at that point that says, great, I hear what you're saying. What would have to happen? What are the bold bets that we can take and to make this happen? And you start to lay that out. And I went through that at Expedia, right? In the day, I came in, they had a $54 million failed data warehouse implementation. They had two legacy environments and they were trying to move everything to this new failed implementation. And they figured it best we could add 30% more people and, we can get there in 18 months. And then, of course, it was 2008. We laid off people, not added people, and we were told to get it done in 12 months. And so we went back and just revisited, like, what are the crazy things that we could do to make this happen? And through that process, we found actually there were some things that we could do to make it happen. It was still a risky proposition. But by the end of that year, we not only retired one legacy environment, which was the goal, we actually retired both legacy environments. And so you got to really start getting the organization to think about how to make it happen. And then the other thing I'll just kind of throw in here before we kind of wrap up is, never stop dreaming. So data mastery, you're never fully there, right? As soon as you get there, you can almost guarantee if you're thinking, original and you continue to look for improvement, there's going to be new opportunities to even grow it's a quest, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, as opposed to a destination, right? And in part because your business is always changing, right, as well. And so that need to adapt to those new opportunities, because they're always there. As bad as things are, you can be sure that there's opportunity to cut costs leveraging analytics and AI to survive and also position you to thrive on the other end of that event, because there's always this wave of opportunity. And so that's the goal, right, is to get to that point as an organization. So some final thoughts. Business landscape is rapidly evolving. And so organizations that have a robust, virtuous learning cycle, they'll adapt and thrive. And you look at the industries that are out there today that do really well, they do this. And matter of fact, you look at newer, newer players into the finance industry. They do this naturally. They didn't have a lot of legacy environment to worry about. And so they were able to do everything fresh and new. And this is at the core of what they do. This is at the core of what leading retail organizations do, like Amazon. Data fluency, though, is the accelerant to thriving in this environment. So you can have a great data platform, maybe you could have great tools in that platform. You can have people out there doing analytics, and you can still be in a data awareness place, right? Where you've got a lot going on, but are you really moving the needle as an organization? And you probably can't even answer that question because you're not measuring. You're making decisions, but you're not necessarily measuring what the outcome of those decisions are. But there are ways to do that as an organization. And I guess, again, not do it and slow things down, actually do it and speed things up. Be bold and break down silos. We've just talked about that. The journey is evolutionary, not revolutionary. Go big or go home. I think it's great to think, dream big, but you got to act, small and iteratively and create value along the way. And then again, don't let your mindset get in the way. Don't let obstacles get in the way. There's a great book out there, The Obstacle is the Way. And it's kind of a stoic way of thinking about things, but it's powerful in what you're able to do the minute you sort of stop fighting it and then look for the way, even though there's obstacles there. And sometimes I found that the obstacle truly turns out to be the way forward. And then, yeah, be curious, creative, daring, and gritty. It's going to be painful and difficult. And then, of course, there's much we can learn from each other. And, looking across industries, I think is really kind of a powerful idea. If you want to learn more, as Jason mentioned, there's a series we've been working on. There's 3 pieces that focus on data fluency, with the latest one coming out tomorrow. And certainly take a look at that. And hey, it's focused on healthcare, but really applies a lot of things that we've learned from industries outside of healthcare. If you see something you disagree with, or you see something you'd like to include, regardless of whether you're in healthcare or not, love to add you in as an author. We're trying to get as many people participating as possible, sharing their ideas so that we can learn from each other. And with that, I think we're ready for Q&A.
Yes, excellent. Hey, thank you, Ryan. That was great. So we've got a lot of really good questions, some comments, some commentary in the chat. First, for
Awesome.
starters, okay, does data literacy equal data fluency? What is the difference? How do you define this? Obviously, organizations might be thinking about something like data literacy differently. So kind of pour some concrete on this for us.
Yeah, it's a good question. I've had to think about this a lot myself. There's actually a book out there that was published on data literacy or data fluency that really got me thinking about it a little bit differently. And also it became this capstone, as you know, for all these articles we've done in the series, for really tying all the pieces together. And I look at, I think data literacy is a component of data fluency, right? I think when you look at your data consumers, your data producers, there's literacy that we need to develop in terms of knowing how to tell stories with data, right? Is an aspect of data literacy. Knowing what kind of questions to ask when somebody gives you a report. When you see predictions, understanding that their probability and knowing how to ask questions around, if we hit that probability, what do we do? If it's this upper end, if it's this lower end, what do we do? So literacy is really that knowledge, that education, that experience that we gain in knowing how to use the tools. But really, there's a lot more that goes on around fluency, right? As we talked about earlier, it's about going deeper in each of those areas, whether it's the data consumers, the data producers, whether it's the data platform or the community. It's going deeper, right? It's about like the tools that we use and the amount of automation that we've done. Fluency is about realizing that, like literacy is a person. We don't really need a person doing that job, right? What we need is actually automation and algorithms to do that job, right? And so that's not literacy in a sense, right? Because we need to I guess you could say we need literacy on how to build the tools to do that and develop that capability, right? And so to me, I think literacy is a component, but really there's a lot more that goes on around data fluency that involves, stuff that we build to support promoting data literacy.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So one of the challenges of self-serve analytics is that many people, quote unquote, just want the data, but are not, particularly interested in the level of engagement that defines a true community. What are some effective strategies for overcoming this challenge? It's a good question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it is the one of the greatest challenges. And I think there's opportunities at all levels, right? Like if you're a super senior leader in the organization, there's things you can do to start moving things in a different direction. I think even if you're a manager in an organization, and I really, some of it is we talked a little bit about, I guess, literacy, earlier, and it is about working with your data consumers and really helping them understand the bigger role that they play in helping to really advance, leveraging data within the organization, and that to give them what they want to create value in the organization, there's things that they need to give in order to support that. And you're not going to find that everywhere, but the key is you're going to have some pockets where people are on board and get it. I think it's about focusing on them and then showing, right, through delivery of value to the organization that operating in a different way is actually creating greater value for the organization, which will incent other people to want to operate that same way. And so some of it is education, right? Taking, something that we've done here and helping to educate the broader organization around these different, building blocks around data fluency and talking about data consumers and what responsibility they have. And then a lot of it is just about showing them, getting together, working with them, delivering solutions, creating value. I think self-service is an interesting one because, as literacy grows, certainly that helps to create an environment where, data consumers can be more self-servant. But it also means you have to have tools that allow that as well. So like for example, at Seattle Children's, the tool they have, they basically depends on like what role you are. If you're an ED physician, if you're a surgeon, you have a completely different interface for doing analysis. And it's really tailored to what it is you're trying to do. And so it's highly customized to what it is they're doing. And they build the reports and they build the dashboards using that tool. So I think you have to have tools too beyond what some of the standard reporting tools that we have today.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. So, a couple more that I would like to get to here. So, in a healthcare model, how involved is this model? How involved for this model are the board of directors, foundations, and the folks that are interfacing with the community? How much training do they need to become quote unquote literate then involved?
Yeah, we're talking about the board members and people at the executive
Exactly.
level.
Yep.
Yeah, I find it really important that they're involved, early on because a lot of times, more the executives than the board. I think you have to kind of focus where the opportunity is, and so a lot, sometimes the opportunity, a lot of times will be in different pockets within the executive area, and focusing on them and really starting to build advocates first at the executive level, and it doesn't have to be everybody, right? And then as they become more fluent, they bring their partners in, and they become more fluent. Eventually, it bleeds over into the board, and then you start to bring the board into those conversations. And so I think it's key about like finding a place to start where you can find an early success that's visible and high value. And if you can do that in a way that includes people at the executive level, go for it, right? I think that's where it starts.
Okay. All right. We have about one more minute left here. So, there's a couple of, questions that might be kind of related here. So, can you quickly talk about how you'd implement the framework and delivery team in a very traditional company that has lower data fluency and a fear of change, and possibly related is, in terms of breaking the silos, is there a best practice for companies with 80,000 plus employees, right? Large legacy multinational, organizations.
Yeah. Yeah, boy, I don't know if there's a formula for it. Because every organization is going to be a little bit different. But the one of the things that I always start with is make the rounds. Just listen a lot and talk to a lot of people in the organization. Keep in mind if you're trying to get something started, it's a big selling exercise, right? You're really trying to sell them on this idea or this concept. And you can't sell it if it's yours. You can only sell it if they own it as well as you. And I think that's a big part of the process is how do you engage the community at all levels as you start to build out this action plan to create this vision and you got to honor the reality of where you are, right, in that vision and tell the story about where you are and then where you want to be and what the gaps are in a way that is easy for people to understand and is honest within the organization. And something that a majority of the people that you talk to look at it and go, that's it, right? You've got it. You know where we are, you know where we want to be. And then you can start having conversations around how do we get started. And getting started isn't about taking over the world. It's about picking a few strategic areas, going for it, demonstrating the value, building out your approach until, 2 years later, it's the standard for how you operate in the organization.
Okay, great. All right. Okay, well, thanks everybody. We're at time. Thanks again for the presentation. We'll send out a
Thank
recording
you.
of the webinar plus access to the slides in the upcoming days. And stay tuned. on our email and social for upcoming webinars, tools and resources, and other content to help design a deliberate and scalable data strategy that drives tangible business value. So have a great day, everybody, and onward and upward.
Thanks, Jason. Thank you all.